The stage lights had barely cooled after the final chords of Woodstock in August 1969, when the stories began to spread. 500,000 people, endless rain, mud, music that didn't seem to stop. But what's easy to forget is that one of the voices that would come to define that experience wasn't there at all. Joni Mitchell never made it to Woodstock. She watched the chaos unfold from a New York hotel room, seeing only what flickered through a television broadcast. And yet, from that distance, she wrote the song that captured its soul more perfectly than any eyewitness could. So how does someone who wasn't there create the anthem for an entire generation's defining moment? The answer lies in timing, what America was becoming, what music was revealing, and what Joni herself was processing in her young but already seasoned career. By 1969, the folk movement was shifting. The era that had begun in small coffee houses with acoustic guitars was now connected to large festival stages, amplifiers, and overnight fame. The culture itself was stretching, caught between idealism and disillusionment. Speaking of context, the months leading up to Woodstock were restless. The Vietnam War had filled living rooms with images no one could unsee. Civil rights marches still turned violent. The assassinations of the late 1960s had left a generation reeling. Yet beneath that turbulence was a shared hope that music could be a sanctuary, a brief return to innocence. The belief wasn't naive, it was survival, and Woodstock, as an event, seemed to embody that wish. It wasn't just a concert, it was a collective exhale. But for Joni, the weekend of the festival took a different shape. She had been booked to appear on a major television show that Sunday night, and her management, fearing travel delays, insisted she stay behind. So she stayed in New York, while her boyfriend at the time, Graham Nash, went on to perform with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Through phone calls and magazine updates, she pieced together the story. The highways closed, the farmers opening their fields, the music stretching through sleepless nights. When she finally sat down at her piano afterward, what came out wasn't reportage, it was myth-making. Her Woodstock distilled a messy, rain-soaked weekend into a vision of something timeless. It spoke to the yearning for purity, for community, for redemption from what the world had become. She transformed a physical gathering into a spiritual one, and that's where the song's power still lives. It's less about where anyone stood in the mud, and more about what they were seeking. Listening to it, you can hear both longing and clarity. Her melody pulses with reverence. Historically speaking, it's one of those rare songs that transcends its literal inspiration to become a cultural artifact, something that reflects an entire generation's emotional topography. It invokes a collective belief that if people simply came together, they could return to some lost sense of harmony. Not politically, but humanly. The thing is, Woodstock isn't really about the festival. It's about the generation's need to believe that such a place could exist at all. It's the dream of escape, of communion, of getting back to the garden, without ever fully leaving the modern world behind. You didn't have to be at the festival to feel that ache. Most people weren't. They watched from their homes, from classrooms, from the quiet spaces of ordinary life. The song gave those listeners permission to belong to the moment anyway. What makes it remarkable is its balance between cynicism and faith. Even as Joni captured the mystical side of Woodstock, she sensed its impermanence. The culture's innocence was already slipping away. Within a few months, that dream would fracture at Altamont. And yet, the song's grace lies in how it preserves hope, like a pressed flower from an era whose colors were already beginning to fade. In a way, Woodstock exists as an emotional document more than a historical one. It freezes a precise feeling in time, the belief that music could reflect who people wanted to be. By writing it from afar, Joni Mitchell became both participant and witness, translating memory into mythology. That's why it endures. Because it wasn't about what she saw, it was about what she understood. 6 minutes that became a mirror for a generation that wasn't there, and somehow still wanted to be. By midsummer 1969, the idea of Woodstock had become something much larger than a music festival. It was a promise whispered from one college campus to another, a sort of pilgrimage for anyone who believed music could be a stand-in for peace. The posters called it 3 days of peace and music. But underneath that simplicity lay months of idealism colliding with logistical chaos. The organizers weren't revolutionaries. They were, in fact, young entrepreneurs chasing a dream and a business opportunity. What made it extraordinary was how those ambitions accidentally opened a space for a generation to see itself. It's important to remember how uncertain the cultural direction felt in those months. The idealism of the early 60s had curdled into exhaustion. The assassinations and the war had darkened the mood, but something in the youth culture resisted despair. Folk was giving way to folk rock, protest songs to psychedelia, but the emotional center remained, the idea that songs could still heal. The road to Yasgur's farm was a literal one, clogged with traffic stretching for miles. But it was also a metaphorical path leading toward an imagined community. For many, it was the hope that, just once, something good could happen without being tainted. The hype began almost by accident. Originally planned for a much smaller venue in upstate New York, the concert was forced to relocate at the last minute when local residents grew uneasy about the flood of young people expected. Word traveled fast. Posters, radio mentions, word of mouth, and before long, tens of thousands were already on the road, heading toward a patch of farmland few had ever heard of. Max Yasgur, a conservative local dairy farmer, stepped forward to offer his land, not out of political belief, but civic decency. His decision would transform both his farm and his name into a symbol of generational generosity. Meanwhile, for the musicians, the build-up was equal parts excitement and uncertainty. By that year's standards, the lineup was staggering. Artists at their creative peak sharing a stage over 3 chaotic days. But even those who performed had little sense of the scale developing around them. Pilots reported endless lines of abandoned cars. Helicopters became the only reliable transport. Nobody expected 500,000 people. Nobody expected that so many would choose to stay even after food, toilets, and medical care proved wildly insufficient. Yet instead of turning on one another, the crowd adapted with a kind of communal patience that astonished observers. For those who actually made it to Yasgur's farm, the first glimpse of the crowd was unforgettable. At dusk, the landscape rippled with movement. Bodies, blankets, candles, all folding into the natural contour of the hill. The rain came in waves, sometimes washing over the stage, sometimes soaking the crowd into laughter. Drugs circulated freely, but so did shared bread, shared shelter, and shared stories. The myth of Woodstock as utopia hides the fatigue, the hunger, the sickness, but there's also a truth at its heart. People wanted to believe they were capable of kindness under pressure. For a generation raised under war headlines, that revelation mattered. Joni Mitchell's absence wrapped the event in a different kind of light. While millions struggled through the mud, she was in Manhattan's Chelsea, reading reports, seeing grainy footage, feeling a distant pull toward something immense, yet unreachable. When she later told the story of writing Woodstock, she described it as an impression drawn from those second-hand accounts, like painting from memory of a dream she never had, but somehow understood. Her imaginative step back is what allowed her to transform the event from spectacle into symbol. Where others saw mud, she saw meaning. To understand why the myth took hold, you have to place Woodstock within the timeline of everything else happening in 1969. The moon landing had just occurred, a triumph of technology and order. A month later, here was its earthly opposite: chaos embraced, structure rejected. yet somehow equally human. It was as though in the same summer, America had looked upward and inward and found itself divided between precision and passion. Woodstock wasn't a rebellion against progress. It was a reminder of the organic instincts that progress often leaves behind. Mitchell sensed that duality, the tension between machinery and humanity, and folded it into her song's gentle lament. But the reality on the ground couldn't match the ideal. Promoters lost money. Local communities were left with damage and debris. Emergency services worked around the clock, overwhelmed but unyielding. The myth of peace coexisted with the exhaustion of everyone who made it possible. Yet when the stories began rolling out in newspapers, the tone was curiously forgiving. Perhaps because, in its failures, Woodstock had demonstrated an improbable harmony. There had been no major violence, no riots, no collapse into chaos. The crowd, despite every hardship, kept its spirit. For the wider public watching from afar, that image became a small redemption story in a decade scarred by unrest. The physical journey toward Yasgur's farm also mirrored a collective emotional one. People left cities, jobs, even families for a weekend that promised something wordless, a reunion, a cleansing. The roads became metaphors for escape. Cars broke down. Strangers shared rides. By the time they arrived, attendees had already lived their own micro-version of the counterculture dream, helping one another through adversity. What awaited them wasn't a neatly organized concert, but a trial of endurance and cooperation. That lived practice of community probably mattered as much as the music itself. In the larger tapestry of that era, Woodstock was both culmination and ending. It gathered the emotional threads of the 60s, the hope, rebellion, spirituality, fatigue, and tied them in one spontaneous knot of sound and mud. Joni Mitchell, interpreting it from afar, recognized that it couldn't last. Her song feels like an elegy as much as a hymn. The phrase, "back to the garden," wasn't nostalgia for childhood. It was a plea for renewal before the dream unraveled. And within months, the darker realities of the new decade would arrive to test that hope. Still, the lasting image of Woodstock, 500,000 young people trudging through the rain in peace, has never completely faded. It persists because it represents not a factual report of what occurred, but an emotional truth about what people wanted from each other. The hype transformed into legend, and the legend became a kind of cultural shorthand. When Joni Mitchell wrote about that, she gave shape to a collective yearning that extended beyond 1969. She turned a weekend into a metaphor for unity and imperfection coexisting. The road to Yasgur's farm, in the end, was never solely geographical. It was a generations-long walk toward the idea of itself. By early 1969, Joni Mitchell's world was suspended between anonymity and recognition. She was known within the inner circles of musicians who traced the folk scene from Toronto coffee houses to New York's Greenwich Village. But mainstream fame still felt uncertain. Her earlier work had been admired for its poetic precision, but it hadn't yet crossed into wide cultural resonance. Critics loved her phrasing. Fellow artists studied her tunings. Audiences, though small, sensed she was building a language that pulled closer to emotion than performance. Every chord seemed designed to confess something, and yet she was restless, aware that artistry alone didn't guarantee permanence. In those years, Joni carried the aura of someone slightly apart. She wasn't trying to be the counterculture's poster child. She wanted craft, not chaos, but the chaos of the era refused to stay outside the window. The late 60s were changing the rules for everyone making music. Festivals replacing clubs, collective ideals replacing introspective voices. For someone like Joni, who valued control and subtlety, that shift felt like both opportunity and threat. The boundary between art and spectacle was blurring, and she found herself learning how to navigate fame without letting it dilute introspection. A few milestones defined that turning point. She had recently released songs that deepened her reputation as a lyricist capable of turning inner thought into shared experience. Her compositions were being covered by major artists, exposing her writing to vast audiences even before she was widely recognized as a performer. That dual identity, the writer's humility combined with the performer's vulnerability, became her lane. It was quiet power in an age of volume. While others plugged into amplifiers, she leaned closer to her voice, refining its emotional clarity. It's important to remember what folk music represented then. It wasn't just a genre, it was a transmission of conscience. Each performer mirrored the audience's moral anxiety. Yet by the time Joni arrived, the field was crowded with slogans and protest chants. She didn't want to shout louder, she wanted to write deeper. Her focus on personal relationships, identity, and nature often skirted the overt politics of contemporaries, but it carried its own critique, an insistence on introspection amidst noise. That stance would make her music both timeless and, in some corners, misunderstood. Meanwhile, her private life was intertwined with the musical landscape. The company she kept, musicians experimenting with sound, harmony, and idealism, formed a creative greenhouse. They shared floors, guitars, and philosophies. Joni's relationship with Graham Nash represented that union of artistic spirits. Together, they balanced her reserved introspection with his open warmth. Inside that circle, she absorbed conversations about community, peace, and art as social glue. Those exchanges would echo through her writing during the months that followed. What people sometimes forget is that Joni wasn't naturally drawn to the crowd. She approached music as composition, not rallying cry. Her connection to the folk circuit was personal, almost sacred. So when the culture began transforming its folk heroes into mass figures, she felt hesitant. Fame of that scale threatened to turn confession into commodity. By 1969, she was performing to larger rooms, her nerves hidden beneath practiced poise, but she still carried the quiet energy of small gatherings. That tension between intimacy and audience shaped her decisions that year, including the fateful one that kept her from Woodstock. Professionally, she was entering a period of astonishing creativity. Her pen moved faster than her public appearances. New melodies poured out of her sessions, many written during solitary stretches in hotel rooms or rented apartments. She traveled light, often alone, sketching worlds inside spiral notebooks until morning. There was a deliberate inwardness to it, a refusal to compete with the louder voices defining the decade. It wasn't detachment, it was calibration. Joni was listening, analyzing, distilling. To understand Woodstock, you have to see it as an extension of that reflective discipline rather than a sudden response to an event. Through 1969, she watched peers like Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young craft big, anthemic harmonies that celebrated unity. Her instinct leaned elsewhere. She looked toward the fissures between people, the spaces where misunderstanding lived. That subtle difference would later allow her to interpret a sprawling, chaotic festival as something spiritual instead of merely spectacular. Where others drew power from the crowd, she drew meaning from distance. That year was her process of constructing an inner observatory, a way to translate social upheaval into personal language. And yet, distance can create perspective. Living in New York that summer offered her a front-row seat to cultural transformation without demand of full immersion. The city was both refuge and pressure cooker. Artists, poets, political radicals all crossed paths in the same parks and clubs. Conversations about the war coexisted with debates about open tuning or line phrasing. Joni listened more than she preached. Every encounter seemed to confirm the same truth. People were exhausted, yet hungry for connection. What she later expressed in Woodstock wasn't fantasy. It was observation filtered through empathy. By midsummer, her schedule was packed with studio sessions and television commitments. Management was pushing her toward broader exposure. she was careful. The stage frightened her less than the possibility of misunderstanding. Being labeled voice of a generation wasn't liberation, it was containment. So when her team prioritized a TV performance over attending the festival upstate, the decision, though regrettable later, aligned with her cautious pragmatism. Joni was learning the cost of presence, the way fame could swallow subtlety. Watching events from afar preserved her clarity, even as it hurt to be left out. Musically, she stood at a crossroads between folk purity and the exploding experimentations of rock. Acoustic storytelling was giving way to electric architecture. Some saw that transition as betrayal. She saw it as evolution. Her later embrace of jazz structures began germinating then, in those downtown sessions where genres blurred and everyone tested boundaries. 1969 was, for her, a laboratory year. Each song tried to balance melody with meaning, tension with tenderness. She was documenting the uncertainty of youth hanging on the edge of transformation, personal and cultural. While the world's attention tilted toward protest and spectacle, Joni found significance in small gestures, a line, a breath, a harmonic shift that carried emotional truth. Her vision of freedom wasn't political in blueprint. It was emotional sovereignty. That nuance separated her from her peers, but also made her their interpreter. When the mud, the rain, and the communal ideal of Woodstock appeared, she instinctively recognized it as symbol rather than scene. Her trajectory through 1969 gave her both distance and context to capture that moment's poetry. In essence, Woodstock emerged from everything that came before the mud, the isolation, the success blooming too fast, the reflection born of watching a generation stretch toward transcendence. Joni Mitchell, in 1969, was already chronicling the end of one innocence and the hesitant birth of another. Her writing that year wasn't escapism, it was reconciliation between solitude and togetherness, ambition and authenticity. That duality positioned her perfectly to articulate what so many felt but couldn't phrase, that even in absence, participation is possible through empathy. Before the festival became legend, Joni had already built the emotional framework to describe it. Her 1969 was a rehearsal in perception, a year of learning how to translate fragmentation into harmony. When she finally composed Woodstock, she wasn't writing from exclusion, but comprehension. The girl who once played coffee houses to a few dozen listeners had by then learned to speak for millions precisely because she never stopped treating music as conversation. And in that, her trajectory through that year became the unseen prelude to one of history's most enduring songs. When people talk about why Joni Mitchell missed Woodstock, it's often summed up as an unfortunate scheduling conflict. But beneath that practical decision lies a moment that revealed how fame, management, and artistic instinct were starting to pull in opposite directions. It was August of 1969, and Joni was in New York preparing for a nationally televised appearance on The Dick Cavett Show. Her manager, Elliot Roberts, faced a choice that seemed reasonable at the time: risk missing the show for a muddy, unpredictable festival, or secure her spot on primetime television. The Cavett booking represented legitimacy, network exposure that validated a career. Festivals were chaotic, famously disorganized, and notoriously difficult to navigate. Even established artists sometimes arrived late or missed sets altogether. For an artist like Joni, whose reputation had been built on precision and control, adding the uncertainty of Woodstock seemed reckless. Roberts made the call. She'd stay in New York. It was a manager's decision, businesslike, pragmatic, and utterly devoid of the spiritual momentum that the festival would soon embody. What nobody realized was that Woodstock wasn't just another gig. For artists attending, it became a cultural baptism. For Joni, watching from afar, It became an absence she would transform into art. That weekend, she stayed in the city's Chelsea neighborhood, close enough to feel the pulse of what was happening upstate, far enough to remain isolated from it. She spent her time rehearsing, giving interviews, and preparing for television's bright, confined space. Cavett Studio would later host many of the festival's performers, some still wearing the exhaustion and wonder of their 3-day miracle. Joni sat among them, listening, absorbing. Her presence there became quietly symbolic, the artist left behind, hearing first-hand accounts of a moment she'd missed. It's easy to imagine the mix of admiration and ache she must have felt as guests described the endless fields of people, the rain, the surreal collaboration of 500,000 strangers inventing a new kind of togetherness. The irony was striking. While they had sung to the open air, she was singing to cameras. Both were audiences, but only one could be touched. That difference would shape everything she created afterward. The decision to stay in New York also revealed something larger about the era's transition. By the late 60s, the industry around music was professionalizing rapidly. Managers, contracts, and appearances carried as much weight as protest anthems. Artists who had started out in informal circles were now part of an economic machine, forced to choose between exposure and experience. Joni's story became a microcosm of that tension. What was safer for the career soon seemed spiritually costly. She wouldn't blame Roberts. She understood the logic, but emotionally, it planted the seed of reflection that grew into Woodstock. Her missed flight became almost mythic. Graham Nash, her partner then, left for the festival without her, joining the new supergroup that would define its sound. As he boarded the helicopter to Max Yasgur's farm, Joni reportedly watched him go, already aware she was being written out of something that felt larger than music. The sky above New York that weekend carried the same haze hanging over history, something immense happening just beyond reach. Artists who did attend would later describe the journey as surreal, highways jammed, no clear path forward, yet everyone determined to get there. Joni stayed behind and received the event as fragments, a phone call, a headline, a breathless radio update. Those fragments became her raw material. Unlike many who performed, she had the advantage of perspective. Distance let her distill. Where others experienced detail, the mud, the smell, the exhaustion, she perceived essence. Sitting at her piano days later, she began transforming hearsay into hymn. Her writing during that period suggests an interesting inversion. What might have been guilt or frustration became empathy. To write Woodstock, she didn't need to be there. She needed to understand what it meant for those who were. And because she'd felt longing rather than participation, her version carried universality. In retrospect, the decision to stay seems like fate performing quality control. If she had gone, she might have joined the long list of exhausted performers whose recollections blurred into logistics. Watching from New York, she became a conduit for imagination. Her restraint made room for myth. In a cultural sense, it was the classic case of absence deepening meaning. The manager's caution inadvertently preserved the artist's clarity. There's also a generational irony. Woodstock celebrated communal instinct, trusting intuition over authority, while Joni's absence was decided by managerial caution, the institution against impulse. Yet that friction is exactly what her generation was negotiating. How do you stay true to art when professional expectations threaten to dilute it? Her decision, by choice or circumstance, captured that question better than any statement could. When the Cavett taping finally aired, the contrast between the freshly returned performers and Joni's composed demeanor was unmistakable. They were sunburned, dazed, still half dreaming. She appeared calm, almost luminous, as though quietly decoding what their stories meant. The audience laughed at anecdotes of rain and traffic. Joni seemed to be listening to something deeper. Later that night, when the lights dimmed and the city resumed its normal rhythm, she began sketching verses that would translate their chaos into transcendence. Historically speaking, that missed flight has become one of music history's great paradoxes, the loss that created vision. It shows how proximity isn't always the path to insight. Sometimes distance lets meaning ripen. And in August 1969, one young artist, temporarily grounded by management's logic, turned absence into immortality. The weekend that 500,000 people crowded into Yasgur's farm, Joni Mitchell stayed behind in New York. It was Sunday evening, August 17, 1969. The rain still fell on the festival. The final acts were stretching into dawn, and in a quiet corner suite up the island, a television flickered. On the screen, reporters struggled to describe what they were seeing: mud, music, and a crowd larger than most American cities. The pictures were grainy, yet even through static, a vision took shape. Joni sat cross-legged, watching, listening, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding just beyond reach. The television acted as her window into an event already becoming myth. News anchors framed it cautiously, part curiosity, part warning. They spoke of traffic jams, shortages of food, and spontaneous cooperation. To Joni, the contradictions felt poetic. The chaos had rhythm. People who, by ordinary logic, should have been miserable were peaceful, even joyful. Somewhere inside those brief, halting reports, she detected a story about faith. You could sense her mind marking phrases, interior headlines: 500,000 together, no violence, music through rain. Each detail became an emotional color she would later mix into harmony. While the networks reduced it to novelty, Joni absorbed it as testimony. The camera panned over faces, young people wrapped in blankets, strangers holding each other, musicians drenched yet determined. She wasn't seeing an audience, she was witnessing communion. In interviews later, she mentioned feeling both envy and awe, the ache of exclusion softened by admiration. That dual feeling, distance and devotion, formed the pulse beneath the song she soon composed. From absence came empathy. She didn't need to smell the mud or hear the amplifiers to know what the gathering represented. She recognized the yearning because she felt it too. Hours passed that night. Outside, Manhattan glowed with its usual precision, but in those hotel walls, the mood was reflective. The city seemed an alternate planet to whatever was happening upstate. She had notes scattered on the carpet, scraps of melody written earlier that week for unrelated projects. Yet the images on screen began rearranging them in her mind. The progression became slower, more deliberate, almost meditative. It was as if she were tuning her piano to the frequency of the news broadcast, trying to find in music what words alone couldn't express. By Monday morning, reports of Woodstock filled the airwaves. The television repeated helicopter shots, showing the mass departure of concert-goers trudging through knee-deep mud, waving goodbye, smiling tiredly. Radio commentators called it a miracle of patience. Newspapers were preparing front-page spreads. For Joni, whose instrument was observation, it became irresistible material, not for a journalistic song, but for an allegory. She began sketching verses, tracing the outline of a pilgrimage rather than a party. The festival's images transmuted into symbols. The crowd became a tribe. The journey north became spiritual ascent. The farm a kind of accidental Eden. The irony resonated deeply with her. While she watched humanity striving for unity on screen, she was confined by professional obligation, a reminder of how fame could isolate even within success. That contrast edged her writing. She turned the television's glow into candlelight, something warm but unreachable. Her lines spoke not of frustration, but yearning for purification, for reconnection. The world outside the screen felt mechanized, fragmented, rushing toward an uncertain decade. In those newscasts of barefoot youth and acoustic guitars, she saw an antidote, however temporary. Every artist knows that inspiration often begins as dissonance. Sitting alone that afternoon, she felt both participant and outsider. The events unfolding 100 miles away were shaping cultural consciousness in real time. Yet her vantage point, a hotel window, granted perspective unattainable to those in the mud. She sensed that this distance might allow her to articulate what the participants could not. The question crystallized. What were they all seeking out there? Peace? Joy? Or something older? A memory of innocence? That question became the seed. Her notebook filled with cascading images. Childhood, gardens, journeys, freedom as rebirth. The next hours turned meditative. She sat at the piano, fingers finding a patient rhythm, half prayer and half lullaby. The melody moved like water. Observers later remarked how Woodstock sounded both ancient and new, like a hymn composed for a future archaeology. That tone began here, in quiet contrast to the city's motion. If the festival expressed communion through sound, her response sought the same communion through silence. She listened inwardly to an event she could only imagine, sculpting emotion from empathy. Meanwhile, television retrospectives continued replaying footage, the crowd singing along, the impromptu shelters, the line of people walking through fog. These flashes of imperfection became sacred icons in her mind. To most viewers, they signaled youthful rebellion. To Joni, they revealed humanity's instinct for togetherness. She carefully avoided directly naming events or politics in her early drafts. Instead, she leaned on timeless archetypes, journeys, transformations, the longing to return somewhere pure. From reportage, she made myth. Within days, the song's skeleton existed, verses whispering of shared origins, of the fragile hope that maybe they were stardust after all. Historically speaking, this creative moment captured a pivot in late 60s consciousness. The decade's activism had begun in protest. By Woodstock's end, it sought renewal. Joni's interpretation marked that turn. Rather than sing about resistance, she sang about restoration. Watching the news, she saw not a movement advancing, but a generation pausing to rediscover its own heart. Her composition translated that revelation into melody. The restrained tempo mirrored her detachment. The soaring refrain echoed collective aspiration. Each chord seemed to negotiate between chaos and calm. The act of watching became metaphor itself. She was, quite literally, observing a generation seek itself on television, a medium that normally transmitted division, now broadcasting unity. Through the screen, she perceived modern media's paradox, technology showing humanity yearning to escape technology. Her hotel room became a liminal space between spectacle and solitude. What she composed there was no protest anthem, no scene report. It was an emotional map of return, guiding listeners toward a simpler, emotional landscape. That subtlety is why the song endures, while many first-hand festival tributes have faded. When friends returned from Yazgur's farm days later, she listened patiently to their stories. They described impossible rain, impromptu generosity, the shock of realizing their audience had multiplied tenfold overnight. She asked questions quietly, almost as a reporter gathering testimony. But the song she was already shaping didn't depend on those details. Their words confirmed rather than inspired her insight, that Woodstock had been less an event than a moment of collective dreaming. In turning to her instrument afterward, she wasn't documenting but interpreting, turning news into narrative and narrative into prayer. There's an elegance in how observation replaced attendance. Distance filtered the noise. Emotion became essence. That creative alchemy defined Joni Mitchell's artistry, seeing beyond scenery into invitation. She transformed televised chaos into internal clarity. For a generation preoccupied with presence, she produced an anthem of absence redeemed. When she later debuted the song, listeners felt transported to a spiritual version of the festival they'd never experienced, precisely because she, too, had not. Her hotel room vigil had universalized Woodstock, freeing it from geography, and so the image remains. Outside her window, Manhattan traffic hums. Inside, A single voice sketches humanity's longing for renewal. The festival's mud becomes metaphorical earth beneath her melody. Each broadcast she had watched symbolically replays in her harmonies, each news headline softened into yearning. Historical observers sometimes treat this as coincidence, that her best-known protest-era composition came from second-hand experience, yet that very remove is what gave the song its transcendence. It wasn't about celebration or protest, but reflection on what it means to seek meaning itself. By the week's end, her draft was complete, spare verses joined by a meditative refrain. She played it alone first, then for a few trusted friends. Those who heard it recognized its strange combination of intimacy and universality. It sounded less like reportage and more like prophecy. Joni had taken what the cameras captured for a single weekend and reshaped it into something timeless, giving voice not only to those who trudged through the mud, but to everyone who wished they had been there. From that quiet hotel room, she issued the final note of the 1960s collective dream, a melody written while watching the news, yet resonating far beyond the screen. Her eyes never left the broadcast that night. Her mind never left the question it posed. What if, for one brief moment, humanity had glimpsed what harmony truly felt like? And with that wondering, the song Woodstock was born, proof that sometimes the most profound witnesses are the ones who were never there at all. When Woodstock finally reached the public, it didn't come first from Joni Mitchell's own voice, the song that she had written in a quiet hotel room, a reflective meditation on a festival she never attended, would transform once more. This time through the harmonies and controlled thunder of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Their version became the definitive anthem for a generation, the sound that most listeners now associate with the word Woodstock itself. But its journey from piano ballad to electric declaration tells us as much about 1969 as the festival ever could. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young were already swimming in the same cultural tides that had produced Joni's song. Each member carried their own version of the counterculture's contradictions, idealism colliding with professionalism, community tested by ego. When Graham Nash brought the song to the group after returning from the festival, it landed in that creative tension like flint. The others heard in it not just melody, but gospel, a unifying message compressed into deceptively simple phrases. They decided to record it before the moment cooled. In doing so, they transformed an introspective hymn into an audible sunrise for the movement that had just gathered in the mud. Their arrangement altered everything. Where Joni's original leaned on the quiet shimmer of piano and the fragile fall of her voice, their version surged with electricity. The opening drum beat marched rather than meditated. The guitars roared like engines of resurrection. Those trademark harmonies, stacked, urgent, outward-facing, turned her personal reflection into communal chant. Historically speaking, this shift captured the broader metamorphosis of late 60s folk into arena rock. A message born in introspection suddenly found itself amplified, literally and figuratively, for millions. For Graham Nash, the emotional weight was doubled. He had witnessed the festival firsthand, helicopters lifting over endless crowds, the makeshift city pulsing with rain and music. Bringing Joni's song into the studio became an act of translation, carrying the mud and the miracle into recorded sound. David Crosby, the group's restless philosopher, recognized it instantly as spiritual material. Stephen Stills, with his producer's ear, built the arrangement around propulsion, a forward motion symbolizing faith in progress despite disarray. And Neil Young, though wary of overexposure, added the sharp grain that kept the hymn from dissolving into sentimentality. The recording process itself mirrored the communal ideals the song proclaimed. In layered takes, they sought not perfection, but resonance, a texture that felt lived in, weathered, half-improvised, like the festival itself. By the time the final mix emerged, the song no longer belonged to its author alone. It had become shared property between vision and experience, distance and immediacy. Listening to it now, you can feel that dual authorship. Joni's mystical imagery anchored by the band's grounded urgency. One wrote of faith, the others sang from it. When the track reached radio in early 1970, audiences who had missed the festival experienced, through it, a sonic replica of togetherness. Folk stations embraced it for its message, rock stations for its power. The timing was uncanny, the cultural afterglow of Woodstock still warm, the nation uncertain where to steer its optimism next. For 3 minutes on the radio, listeners could believe that unity had a sound, that even in fragmentation, harmony was possible. The song offered closure to an event that had been anything but conclusive. Part of its magnetism came from contrast. Joni's version felt like dawn over still water. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young's felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. That difference mattered because it reflected two sides of the same generational coin. Hers captured yearning, theirs proclaimed arrival. The coexistence of those interpretations mirrored the cultural dialogue happening everywhere. Reflection versus revolution, subtlety versus spectacle. Together, they documented a generation learning how to express identity both inwardly and outwardly. Musically, their recording embodied the technological leaps that defined the era. Multi-track layering allowed the harmonies to swell like choirs. Electric guitars, once symbols of rebellion, now carried ideals of transcendence. The song's famous refrain spread beyond lyrics into sonic construction, the convergence of folk purity and rock volume. Listeners felt included without needing to attend any festival at all. It turned passive listening into imagined participation, much as Joni herself had turned absent witnessing into art. Yet the band's version wasn't simply louder, it was architectural. Each voice entered like a pillar, supporting a spiritual edifice built from 4 distinct egos somehow aligned for one take. That alignment wouldn't last long. Their internal conflicts soon became legendary, mirroring the fragmentation of the wider movement they represented. But for that recording, harmony, literal and figurative, briefly triumphed. The fact that such fragile cooperation could produce the defining sound of Woodstock only intensified the song's mythology. For the public, this cover crystallized everything the festival had promised. It painted Woodstock not as muddy chaos, but as ascension, a national awakening set to shimmering chords. It overlooked hunger, disorganization, exhaustion, but magnified grace. In doing so, it distilled a complicated reality into emotional essence. That simplification wasn't deception, it was catharsis. People needed to believe that the fogged ideal of peace could still resonate through speakers in their living rooms. The record gave them that faith. Critics at the time recognized its immediacy. Reviewers called it both a summary of the 60s and a hopeful overture for the decade ahead. Some noted how its martial beat sounded almost like a procession, a fitting march away from crisis toward possibility. Others sensed the melancholy beneath its triumph, especially when comparing it to Joni's original. That dual reading remains. One version grieving innocence lost, the other celebrating innocence declared. Together, they frame the cultural hinge between eras. For Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, Woodstock also functioned as a manifesto. It proved that harmony, both musical and social, could be dramatic without aggression. In an industry quickly leaning toward cynicism, the song's optimism felt radical. Each performance became a kind of ritual. Audiences sang along as though reclaiming collective identity through repetition. The line between auditorium and congregation blurred. In that sense, their rendition wasn't just entertainment, but reenactment. A recurring echo of the festival itself, inside every venue that followed. Over time, the song detached from chronology. It came to symbolize not the actual event, but the memory of believing such an event could mean something. Even listeners born decades later could sense in those harmonies the residue of communal yearning. The fact that both versions thrived, Joni's quiet revelation and CSNY's electric roar, shows how adaptable that yearning was. Whether whispered or shouted, the sentiment endured, a wish to be part of a moment larger than oneself. Looking back, it's almost poetic how the song that defined Woodstock was born from absence and adopted by presence. The dialogue between author and interpreters captured the entire cycle of idealism, dreamed, lived, remembered. Joni's solitary reflection validated the inner life of the movement. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young's broadcast extended it into public inheritance. If Woodstock the festival dissolved with the decade, Woodstock the song ensured its spirit had an afterlife, and perhaps that's the truest measure of its impact. When you hear those harmonies crest, whether through static on an old radio or a restored recording on modern speakers, you're touching history not as chronology, but emotion. The music becomes living evidence that for one trembling instant, art, faith, and community converged. The festival became myth, the myth became melody, and the melody became memory. That memory, carried by countless voices since, remains the echo of a generation's brief unity, one written by the person who wasn't there, and immortalized by the band that was. When listeners first heard Joni Mitchell sing "We Are Stardust, We Are Golden," few paused to consider that the statement carried scientific as well as spiritual truth. The image wasn't random poetry. It was a quiet fusion of astrophysics and longing. Every element in the human body, forged in collapsing stars over billions of years, now found itself mud-covered on a dairy farm in upstate New York. Trying to rediscover harmony, Mitchell turned that paradox, the cosmic and the human, the infinite and the fleeting, into melody. It's what makes the song more than commemoration. It's reflective scripture for the secular 20th century. At its core, Woodstock works like myth. Myths don't record what happened. They articulate what people felt about what happened. When Mitchell wrote those lines, she wasn't describing individuals trudging through rain, but translating a generational emotion into universal terms. Stardust represented origins, the idea that humanity shares matter and destiny. Golden implied innocence and value. The garden symbolized both paradise lost and future redemption. Compress those archetypes into a repetitive refrain, and you've built an entire cosmology inside 6 minutes of music. She had created a small Genesis rewritten in the language of folk. Context matters here. The late 1960s were drenched in science headlines, space exploration, environmental anxiety, the first photographs of Earth from orbit. Suddenly, humankind could see itself as a small, glowing orb in endless dark. Mitchell instinctively braided that perspective into her writing. Stardust appeared less mystical once one remembered that scientists had announced the same idea on television, that our bodies were made of recycled star matter. What she offered was not discovery, but recognition, a lyrical translation of atomic kinship into emotional kinship. In her hands, astrophysics became reassurance that everyone belonged. The phrase billion-year-old carbon, which surfaces in her later work, reveals how deeply she carried that concept. It demonstrated continuity between universal age and personal breath. In Woodstock, that sensibility whispered beneath every chord change. When she described returning to the garden, she wasn't evoking nostalgia for Eden. She was aspiring to ecological and spiritual balance, to a time before possession and division. In an era frightened by mechanization and war, that image resonated as antidote, a reminder that simplicity might still heal sophistication. Part of the song's endurance stems from its resistance to naming specifics. By omitting dates and directives, Mitchell elevated transient experience to timeless fable. Folk music often thrives on immediacy, protest, events, causes, but her storytelling stretched past reportage. That restraint is what makes Woodstock a truly historical artifact. It encapsulates not who attended or what was played, but why people needed to believe in such gatherings at all. The composition's ambiguity allows each generation to project its own yearning upon it. Vietnam faded, yet the desire to get ourselves back to the garden never did. Listening closely to the progression, you sense deliberate pacing. The melody ascends like slow revelation, then circles back, as if mirroring the cyclical search for innocence. Harmonically, it's built to breathe, space between phrases mirroring space between individuals seeking unity. Her vocal phrasing bends time. Notes linger where words yearn. This fluidity gives the composition its meditative quality, allowing audiences to inhabit emotion rather than observe it. It functions not as anthem in the traditional sense, but as communal reflection. Even decades later, the song feels less performed than remembered. What's remarkable is how Mitchell fused collective hope with individual introspection. Woodstock invites empathy on two levels: identification with a generation and recognition of personal incompleteness. The listener doesn't need to share political leanings or festival nostalgia to feel the tug toward lost harmony. That dual resonance explains its longevity. It can accompany documentary footage of 1969 or play quietly in a modern car stereo and carry equal weight. Few songs manage to feel both ancient and immediate. This one achieves it by aligning cosmic imagery with human fragility. The spiritual lexicon she employed owed something to earlier folk traditions, but reframed them without dogma. Biblical references, children of God, getting back to the garden, became universal metaphors rather than sermons. They allowed secular listeners to experience transcendence without theology. In this sense, Woodstock anticipated the broader cultural shift toward inner spirituality that would define the 1970s. The song replaced institutional faith with experiential revelation. You don't need a church if you have shared intention and melody. That message struck chords far beyond the original audience, and yet, beneath the radiance, a melancholy vibration persists. Mitchell's lyrics carry awareness of impermanence, the knowledge that unity glimpsed in harmony rarely survives contact with history. When she imagines bombers turning into butterflies, she isn't denying war, she's pleading against inevitability. The vision holds tension between hope and futility, faith and realism. That tension marks the maturity of her writing. Rather than promise salvation, she invites longing, leaving the outcome unresolved. The ambiguity lets the song live wherever idealism meets exhaustion. If we think of Woodstock as myth, then the figures within it are pilgrims. They walk, they seek, they arrive transformed. This structure mirrors countless archetypal stories, from Exodus to the Odyssey. Mitchell intuitively placed her generation within that timeless narrative, travelers leaving the industrial smog to reclaim purity. The difference is that her pilgrims don't find literal paradise, they rediscover perspective. By calling them 500,000 strong, she replaced individual heroism with collective awakening. It's myth updated for mass society, the journey not of the one, but of the many. Analyzing the mythology also means acknowledging its cultural costs. Myths comfort, but they simplify. Woodstock condensed a chaotic, contradictory weekend into emblematic redemption. That simplification allowed belief to survive disappointment. For months afterward, as news of violence and fragmentation overshadowed optimism, Mitchell's song preserved a healing illusion. Some critics later argued that it romanticized the counterculture. Yet its endurance suggests that even illusions can serve purpose when they articulate hope during transition. The accuracy matters less than the aspiration. Myths, after all, survive because they tell emotional truth when factual truth feels unbearable. The pairing of ecological imagery and musical repetition further deepened its resonance. The refrain's circular form mimics nature's cycles, birth to death to rebirth. Musically, it invites participation. Audiences instinctively hum along, joining the renewal it describes. That participatory structure transformed private listening into communal ritual. Decades later, when sung at memorials, protests, or outdoor concerts, it reactivates the same instinct, belonging through sound. The myth becomes accessible through repetition. Every chorus acts as minor resurrection of the festival spirit. Joni's songwriting methodology reveals the conscious layering behind that effect. She often spoke of painting with chords, as though harmony were color. For Woodstock, she used open tunings that let notes ring into each other, blending resonance instead of maintaining separation. The result sounds like humanity overlapping, distinct yet inseparable. This technical choice amplifies the song's philosophy. Her guitar becomes microcosm of community, individual strings vibrating simultaneously toward one shared tone. Such subtle craftsmanship embeds meaning without needing lyrical explanation. Over time, cultural memory fused the song and the event so tightly that many assume they were separable from the start. In truth, Mitchell's composition arrived after the fact, shaping perception rather than reflecting it. That inversion is crucial to understanding modern mythology. Often, art doesn't document revolutions. It defines how revolutions are remembered. Woodstock demonstrates that collective identity can be curated through melody. The festival created footage. The song bestowed interpretation. Without it, the event might have remained anecdote. With it, it became parable. As the years passed, that parable adapted to new purposes. Environmental movements borrowed its garden imagery, framing conservation as spiritual return. Educational programs used its lyrics to illustrate idealism and interconnectedness. Popular culture echoed its phrases in films, essays, even brand campaigns, proof of how mythology migrates once detached from origin. Each retelling diluted specifics but preserved core emotion. Faith in the possibility of rebirth. Historians may debate accuracy, but emotion keeps these artifacts alive. We Are Stardust survives because it still sounds like an instruction. There's a deeper reason the song endures in nostalgic imagination. It allows listeners to re-inhabit youth not through rebellion, but reflection. Many who were 20 in 1969 now hear it as subtle elegy for their own past. The line, "Back to the Garden," acquires generational irony. No one can truly return, but maybe memory can approximate it. In this way, Woodstock functions like folk therapy, guiding aging ideals toward acceptance. Nostalgia becomes not regression, but gratitude for having once believed so entirely. In performance, Joni's delivery reinforces that bittersweet clarity. She doesn't push the words. She allows silence to underscore them. The restraint suggests wisdom after revelation, an elder recounting dream more than evangelizing it. Even early recordings carried that reflective tone, as though she already knew the myth would outgrow her. Audiences sense it instinctively. They listen less to celebrate than to remember. The song has become a communion service for secular memory, reminding participants that faith, even in retrospect, remains faith. From a cultural historical perspective, Woodstock occupies rare space between reportage and ritual. It bridges journalism's urge to witness and poetry's desire to transcend. Each verse acknowledges temporal context, the war, the smog, the mass of seekers, while each chorus dissolves time entirely. That oscillation mirrors collective memory itself, factual fragments surrounded by emotional haze. In studying it, one glimpses the mechanics of myth-making at work, the way repetition sanctifies experience until it becomes identity. The phrase "billion-year-old carbon" evokes final continuity. It reminds us that the children in the field and the poet in her hotel room shared more than ideals. They shared lineage traced to the stars. By rooting peace in elemental connection, Mitchell offered vision bigger than politics. In her cosmology, to hurt another was to deny shared origin, To pollute was to desecrate ancestry. Listeners didn't need to grasp the physics. They only needed to feel humble beneath it. The humility invited compassion, and compassion briefly felt like progress. Ultimately, Woodstock endures because it translates a temporal miracle into universal grammar. It teaches that distance can clarify, that myths can unify, that music can document emotions facts can't capture. The stardust she invokes isn't metaphor alone. It's reminder that meaning outlives circumstance. Billion-year-old carbon, reorganized into voice and chord, momentarily remembered its own brilliance. And through that remembering, an absent witness gave a fleeting generation its enduring myth that even amid noise and division, humanity remains made of the same light, still yearning, still golden, still on its long walk back to the garden. Half a century later, Woodstock continues to sound less like a souvenir and more like a recurring conversation between generations. Its staying power comes from how gracefully it detaches from the details of 1969 without losing their emotional pulse. When it echoes today, from vinyl grooves, radio retrospectives, or streaming playlists, it still feels like testimony. The song remembers not just the festival, but the hunger behind it, the craving for innocence, for a community unshaken by cynicism. That longing doesn't age. Each era inherits its own unrest, its own reasons to look backward for proof that unity once existed. Woodstock keeps offering that reassurance. It reminds listeners that empathy can outlast ideology, that yearning itself can be a creative force. In museums, films, and commemorative broadcasts, the melody functions like collective muscle memory. You hear it and recall a time when faith in harmony, social and musical, still felt achievable. Even for those born decades later, it becomes an introduction to the emotional vocabulary of the late 60s, an unspoken course on what people hoped music could heal. What makes it endure is balance. The song acknowledges loss without despair and believes without preaching. Its refrain remains open-ended. Back to the Garden describes direction, not destination. That subtlety keeps it alive as the world shifts from idealism to realism and back again. Each new listener seems to recognize themselves in its circular melody, searching, uncertain, still walking. Today, Woodstock is history disguised as invitation. It encourages memory as participation, not nostalgia as retreat. When Joni Mitchell first shaped those chords from absence, she built a mirror that continues reflecting whoever looks into it. Time moves forward, but her song keeps the same quiet heartbeat of possibility. And as long as people keep reaching for that harmony, Woodstock keeps singing back.